Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot across marble tiles still warm from the afternoon sun. The scent of rosewater and baked earth curling up from the stone. You're stepping into a world that no longer exists except in the whispers of old poems. The cracks of broken pottery and a few scandalous pages never meant to survive the fire. Welcome to ancient Persia, land of forbidden glances, hidden love letters, and rituals so elaborate you'll wonder if anyone ever got around to actually falling in love. The moon's hanging low tonight, soft as a brushed cheek, and behind every curtain lies another secret, another pair of eyes daring to watch you too long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where this strange little night is finding you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through a garden slick with dew, where fig trees sag under the weight of their own fruit and night-blooming jasmine winds around the columns like something alive. Somewhere, water trickles into a marble basin, slow and rhythmic like a heartbeat that hasn't decided if it's excited or afraid. This isn't just a garden, it's a trap for the senses. Everything here was designed to stir you, distract you, seduce you. Welcome to a Persian palace, circa a few thousand years ago, where seduction wasn't a side effect of love, it was the game, the job, the ritual, and sometimes the only weapon a woman or man ever had. And here's where things get deliciously inconvenient. You're not royalty, not even nobility. You're just here. A servant maybe, a traveling poet, a very well-dressed nobody with a good smile and poor timing. You pass a column where someone once scratched a love poem, probably while pretending to tie their sandals. The letters are faded, but the intent is clear. Someone risked their neck to write this. And that's the vibe we're running with tonight. Because love in ancient Persia, it wasn't safe. It wasn't casual. And you probably won't survive this dot, so let's talk about the rules of engagement. The literal kind. In a society ruled by kings who thought they were semi-divine and priests, who thought desire was a disease, falling in love was like trying to light a candle in a sandstorm. Still, people managed. Some did it with a glance across a room crowded with eunuchs and dancers. Others with a letter tucked inside a bread loaf. Or a perfume bottle laced with enough musk to send someone spiraling into fever dreams. Historians still argue whether the love rituals in these courts were heartfelt or strategic, whether passion ever survived past the first moonlit kiss, or whether that kiss was mostly about palace, politics, and scented oil budgets. You pass through an archway, into a chamber lit only by oil lamps, their flames flickering like flirtations. A girl not more than 16, draped in layers of silk dyed with indigo and saffron, glides past you, leaving behind a trail of cardamom and quiet defiance. She's not a concubine, not officially, but she's here for inspection. Tonight, a royal scribe will write a poem about her hair. Tomorrow, someone else might write her out of history altogether. You keep walking, careful not to speak too loudly. Walls in this place don't just have ears, they have ambitions. Now for a brief intermission from the dreamy visuals, a true story. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, one Persian queen, once slighted by a concubine's popularity, poisoned an entire harem's worth of rose oil. The concubines broke out in blistering rashes during a royal bath, and for one glorious week, she reigned supreme in the king's affection. Was it love? Was it jealousy? Or was it a savage skincare monopoly? Historians still debate. But either way, Persian love was rarely innocent. It was clever, calculated, and occasionally catastrophic. And that brings us to the real question. What is love when your body isn't yours? When your choices are bartered between uncles and temple clerics? And when your only way to say, "I love you," might be a folded scarf left under a mango tree? In ancient Persia, love rituals weren't romantic. They were political, religious, and often terrifying. Picture this. A noble woman caught exchanging notes with a palace guard might not just lose her honor, she could lose her tongue. But sometimes, she risked it anyway. There's a strange kind of power in being watched. The Persians knew this. They designed their palaces and their relationships to be performative. Layers of veils, not to conceal but to tease. A public bath, not just to cleanse, but to flaunt. And poetry, oh, the poetry. Erotic metaphors disguised as spiritual enlightenment. Metaphysical longing wrapped around verses so tender they made grown men weep into their pistachio cakes. Love was everywhere and nowhere. It lived in shadows and hints, in the crackle of silk skirts and the slow pour of honey into wine. A fringe tidbit for you? There's some evidence, albeit thin, that Persian courtiers trained in scent choreography. Yes, that's a phrase. Basically, they would perfume different parts of the body with distinct oils, so a lover could trace them blindfolded, like reading a scented map. Some scholars say it's fiction, a fantasy from erotic novels written centuries later. Others swear by old texts hinting at invisible trails of the beloved. Either way, it's a detail worth slipping into your imagination, your now. In the women's quarters, but don't expect a sleepover vibe. This place is part sanctuary, part cage. The women here know how to fight with perfume and sarcasm. A favored concubine might get a villa, a garden, and first pick of jewelry shipments. An unfavored one might get sent to a colder province with a bitter eunuch and no wine. Alliances are forged with embroidered cushions, betrayals whispered between. Hairbrushes. And love? Love is the ghost in the room. The thing no one talks about, but everyone is haunted by. You catch a glimpse of a clay tablet, part of an old love spell recipe. Crushed myrrh, rose petals, a feather from a night bird, and 7 strands of hair from the target's comb. Mix with wine, murmur their name, and wait. Did it work? Maybe. Did someone get caught trying? Definitely. Foucault once argued that the surveillance of sexuality in ancient systems was less about morality and more about control of inheritance, lineage, property. And here, in this very hallway, someone probably whispered a name they shouldn't have. And meant it thought so. Welcome, once again, to the place where secrets are scented and love is a battlefield made of brocade and betrayal. You're in now, no safe exits, just stories. And saffron. You feel the weight of eyes before you even see the room. It's a salon draped in pale linen and lit by flickering oil lamps tucked inside wall niches, the shadows dancing in rhythm with the murmurs of conversation. No one is speaking loudly. Persian flirtation is an art form that thrives on restraint. Here, you learn quickly that a glance lasts longer than a sentence, that a hand lingering too long on a cup of wine is not an accident, that eyes are more dangerous than daggers, and that wearing the right shade of kohl could get you noticed by the wrong person, or the right one, depending on your plans for the evening. A woman in a violet veil walks past, her anklets chiming. In a perfect 5-beat rhythm, a code that someone across the room might decipher. You're watching a game, but no one tells you the rules. You're meant to feel the tension, the invitation. This is Persian courtship, a ritual choreography performed not with words, but with subtlety and silence, where the more you conceal, the more you reveal. A lover's eye called cheshem idel, or the eye of the heart, was believed to carry the essence of desire. In elite circles, knowing how to look was considered as important as knowing how to speak. It wasn't about seduction through action. It was seduction through implication. A flicker of recognition, a slow blink, a look held 1 beat too long. These were the weapons of choice, and they were sharper than steel. Courtiers often rehearsed glances the way generals rehearsed battle formations. Mothers trained daughters to tilt their heads just so, to laugh lightly while covering their mouths, to bite the corner of their veils when pretending to be shy. Men, too, weren't exempt. A well-groomed beard, a perfectly timed sigh, the twitch of a brow, all could be tools of suggestion. The game was ancient and endless. You weren't supposed to win. You were supposed to keep playing. One story survives, though of course its details have been stretched thinner than baklava pastry. A young poet fell in love with a noblewoman he wasn't allowed to speak to. Every evening, he stood on a balcony across from her courtyard, holding a book upside down just to pretend he wasn't staring. She would water her basil plant, always at dusk, always wearing green. For weeks, that was it. A glance, a shared moment, a ritual, until one day, she dropped her jug on purpose, and he understood. That night, he climbed the wall and was never seen again. Theories? Some say they escaped to a distant province. Others say he was caught, tortured, and his poems burned. But a handful of lines survived, etched into a piece of clay buried near an old olive grove. They weren't particularly good poems, but the intent? Electric. And here's where things get even more tangled. Class mattered. A noble could afford to flirt in public within limits. A servant? Not so much. The punishment for inappropriate eye contact could range from a whipping to a reassignment to colder provinces, or worse, spiritual purification rituals that involved fasting, confession, and a deeply awkward session with a Zoroastrian priest who hadn't flirted since Cyrus the Great was in diapers. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely enforced or mostly symbolic, but the fear they instilled was real enough to make people blink carefully. Now, for a deliciously weird fringe fact, some Persian noblewomen used to wear amber jewelry not just for beauty, but because it generated static electricity. That's right, static. They believed the spark could charge their aura, making them more magnetically desirable. Whether that ever worked is anyone's guess, but imagine trying to flirt while your earrings keep zapping you. A shock of love, literally. Still, some pushed the rules. A concubine named Anis, known for her green eyes and fatal sarcasm, once seduced the Shah's scribe just by staring at him during breakfast. She didn't speak, she didn't smile, she just looked. By the end of the week, he had rewritten the calendar to include her birthday as a national holiday. She fell from favor a year later, rumor says she mocked the Queen's handwriting, but the look remained legendary. Copies of her portrait were banned, but one survived, hidden beneath the floorboards of a perfumer's shop in Ray. And if you believe the tale, people still gather there once a year to drink anise wine and practice the Anis glance. Not kidding. And then there's poetry. Always poetry. The Persians were obsessed with it. Falling in love wasn't official until someone had written a metaphor involving wine, the moon, and a bird. Bonus points if you managed to sneak in a reference to burning, drowning, or melting. Court poets were frequently hired not just to flatter rulers, but to craft subtle erotic messages between lovers. They'd slip verses into folded fabrics, stitch rhymes into pillowcases, or whisper them in the hammam while pretending to chat about weather. It wasn't just pretty language, it was currency, it was weaponry, it was emotional espionage. Some scholars claim that even military codes sometimes borrowed from love poetry, using romantic metaphors to mask messages. The gazelle trembles in the orchard might actually mean the general has arrived at the fortress. Historians still debate the validity of these examples, but the possibility is enough to make you question every dusty scroll ever found. In a clay pot, you sit now in a quiet alcove, watching as two figures across the room avoid eye contact like it might set the building on fire. You realize then this isn't about sex, not really. This is about power, control, fantasy, the idea that someone might choose you when they shouldn't, that a glance might become a revolution. That silence, in the right setting, is the loudest confession of all. So tonight, as you lie in bed, remember, in ancient Persia, love didn't come with serenades or grand declarations. It came in coded gestures and glances so slow they felt like falling. It came in the flick of a veil, the click of an anklet, the echo of a poem you didn't write, but could have. Love came quietly, but it changed everything. You turn a corner and nearly trip over your own awe. The hallway gives way to a chamber that might as well be the navel of heaven. If heaven had a penchant for velvet drapes, ivory combs, and small orchestras playing music only beautiful people understand. This is the royal bedchamber, Lessa. Bedroom, more a carefully constructed fantasy sponsored by the Empire. Pillars carved like date palms hold up a ceiling painted with constellations, so that even while making love, the Shah can pretend the stars are watching. And make no mistake, everything in this room is meant to be watched. The mirrors aren't just for vanity, they're for surveillance. The incense isn't for prayer, it's to mask the smell of betrayal. The pillows? Possibly bugged with metaphorical. Snakes. You sit down cautiously on a divan that probably has a history more dramatic than a 5-season soap opera. This is where power doesn't sleep at lounges, plotting its next desire in silk pajamas. Now, forget the fantasy for a second. A Persian royal harem was not a leisure camp. It was an administrative institution, a machine. Some harems housed hundreds of women wives, concubines, favorites, entertainers, spies, and at least one woman who was definitely just there for the figs. Managing it required record-keeping, protocols, schedules, and ranking systems more complicated than modern. Academia. There were eunuchs to guard the gates, scribes to log who spent how many nights with whom, and advisors who interpreted dreams and menstrual cycles like war omens. The Shah didn't just stroll in and point at a woman. He consulted scrolls. He weighed political implications. He occasionally asked the stars. And yet, despite all this bureaucracy, things still got messy. People still fell in love. Or lust. Or something dangerous in between. Take the case of Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. Legend says she ruled her husband as ruthlessly as any general by day. She drafted foreign policy. By night, she drafted ultimatums in bed. One concubine who tried to outshine her was reportedly found with her tongue dyed blue. Was it poison? A cosmetic accident? A warning? Historians still argue over the details, but the message was clear. Bedchambers in Persia were arenas. You didn't just win affection, you survived it. Every night, a ritual unfolded. Selected women would bathe in saffron and milk, their hair combed with silver tools, while musicians played songs that used to be religious until someone realized they worked better as seduction anthems. They'd be dressed not in ostentatious jewels, but in robes designed to fall off gracefully. One by one, they'd be escorted to the Shah's private chamber, each announced like a course in an elaborate meal. But he didn't always choose. Sometimes he sent them back. Sometimes he summoned a poet instead, or a dancer, or no one. And when he did choose, the chosen woman might leave the next morning with new titles, new lands, maybe a new enemy. Or she might never be seen again. And what of the Shah himself? Was he a tyrant or a lonely man padded in too many silks, chasing something that always dissolved at dawn? Persian kings were said to be chosen by Ahura Mazda himself. Their bodies, too. Sacred for mere mortals. But sacredness doesn't make you lovable. Some Shahs became obsessed with a single woman, elevating her until the court revolved around her smile. Others grew bored quickly, replacing lovers like wine goblets. One particularly cruel monarch kept a concubine in a mirrored box for a month so she could see her own beauty and understand her fate. She eventually escaped disguised as a washerwoman. Whether she lived happily ever after or drowned in a barrel of ink is unclear. What is clear is that desire in the royal bedchamber could be a blessing or a blood sport. Let's zoom out for a second. Scholars still debate whether harems were entirely coercive or if some women wielded genuine influence. Certainly, there were those who played the long game learning politics, languages, even astronomy, until they could advise the king in whispers. Some bore sons who would become rulers, Some wrote poetry under pen names. One, according to Peter Webb's collection of erotic history, trained herself in the art of dreaming lucidly so she could tell the Shah his future through dreams she conveniently shaped while half asleep on a bed of crushed peacock. Feathers, a side note, because you deserve it. Persian bedchambers sometimes had what we'd now call mood architecture. Ceilings painted with shifting light patterns, walls inlaid with mother-of-pearl to reflect candlelight, cooling systems that let a breeze hum softly through the stone lattice. Sensuality was built into the architecture. There are even rumors of whisper tunnels, hollow tubes that carried sound from one chamber to another, allowing gossip, songs, or pillow talk to travel discreetly. Imagine whispering a poem into the wall, only for your secret lover 3 rooms away to hear it while pretending to read political documents. A romantic thriller waiting to happen. And of course, no Persian palace was complete without scandal. One scribe documented a case where the Shah became enamored with a slave girl who played the lute. She refused to speak to him unless he learned the instrument himself. Intrigued, he spent 6 months practicing. By the time he could play her favorite song, she had fallen in love with the stable boy. The Shah, in a rare act of mercy or exhaustion, gifted them a villa and wrote a song about heartbreak that court musicians were banned from performing. But they did, in secret. Because love like that doesn't happen often, and songs like that deserve to echo. Now, a final peek at something that might haunt your dreams. Some queens kept emotional logs, diaries not of what happened, but of how they felt. One such scroll, partially recovered, included lines like, "Today, the king did not look at me, and I smiled but it was not returned." These fragments are the emotional fallout of a system built on control. No matter how many perfumes or silk, veils, no matter how many dancers and dinners and dream interpreters, sometimes a woman just wanted to be seen. So next time someone tells you ancient love was simple or pure or sacred, remind them of the royal bedchambers of Persia, where desire was a political currency, where a glance could crown or condemn, where power lay not just in gold, but in the rhythm of a song, the taste of honeyed figs, and the way one person might risk everything just to be chosen for a night, a moment, a memory that no scribe would dare record, but that still lingers. Somewhere in the warm dust of a forgotten pillow, you hear the chanting before you see the faces, low, rhythmic, like honey thickened with ash. A circle of women in crimson robes stand beneath a cypress tree, grinding herbs into bowls carved from animal bone. One of them, older than the rest, flicks saffron strands into the mixture and murmurs a word you don't recognize, but it tastes like danger. Welcome to the hidden rituals of Persian love magic, where desire is brewed with pomegranate juice and grave dirt, and one wrong chant might summon more than just a lover. You're not in the marketplace anymore. You're in the underbelly of longing, where superstition and sensuality blur, and the line between love me and own me is disturbingly thin. Now don't panic, but you've stepped into a fertility rite. This particular ritual involves honey, wine, and a goose feather that's not going anywhere you'd expect. In ancient Persia, especially among rural and nomadic communities, sex wasn't just a private act. It was cosmic. Love was seen as an energy that could tip the balance between fertility and famine, joy and disease. So yes, sometimes it meant mixing sandalwood oil with your own tears. Sometimes it meant whispering your lover's name into a jar of dates and burying it under a fig tree. Sometimes it meant, allegedly, grinding the dried tongue of a snake into your bathwater because someone's aunt swore it made your skin irresistible. Historians still argue whether these practices were literal or symbolic, but the recipes survive in coded texts, in grandmother's stories, in incense blends that seem too specific to be accidental. Here's one story that refuses to die. A merchant's daughter in Shiraz, known for her sharp tongue and sharper cheekbones, was said to have ensnared the crown prince using nothing more than a scented oil she made herself. The secret ingredient? 7 rose petals stolen from a funeral wreath, mixed with almond milk and left under a full moon. Did it work? Well, he married her, then died mysteriously 2 years later. Some say it was poison. Others say it was love and overdose. Either way, her blend became legend. For decades, women visited her grave just to rub the dirt between their fingers, hoping a little of her magic would rub off. And then there's the wine. Not just any wine, saffron wine, brewed in secret, steeped in songs of longing. It was said to unlock the heart's deepest desires, or at the very least make you bold enough to act on them. Tavern girls would slip it to shy patrons. Dancers would sip it before performance. And once, a traveling scholar reportedly drank so much of it he wrote a 400-line erotic poem to a man he'd only seen once from behind a tapestry. The poem, tragically, was burned, but a few lines survived in another scholar's notes. One, roughly translated, goes, "If your eyes are a lie, let me live in delusion forever." Quirky detour, Persian love spells often involved fruit. Apples, grapes, figs, symbols of desire, yes, but also carriers of messages. One bizarre method involved carving a lover's name into an apricot pit and then swallowing it with wine during the festival of Mithra. Another required placing a clove-stuffed orange beneath your pillow for 3 nights, dreaming of your beloved, and squeezing the juice over a rose bush while reciting their name backward. Supposedly, if they sneezed within the hour, they'd fall in love or catch a cold. Records are inconclusive, but magic wasn't all flowers and flirtation. There were darker currents too. Jilted lovers sought revenge through curses-binding rituals written in red ink and buried beneath doorways. One scroll unearthed near Persepolis was covered in a plea to make a rival barren, unattractive, and haunted by frogs. Yes, frogs. Possibly metaphorical, possibly not. Love potions were matched by unloved potions, designed to sever affection, end obsession, or cool lust. The ingredients? Often foul. Crushed insects, burnt hair, urine, none of it romantic. But all of it. Deeply believed. Now, let's talk about the ritual baths. These were no casual spa days. The Persian art of seduction began with cleansing, not just for hygiene, but for transformation. Bathhouses were semi-sacred spaces where women would prepare for nights of courtship by exfoliating with ground walnut shells, massaging musk oil into their scalps, and singing old songs that doubled as incantations. A woman wasn't ready until she smelled like longing and looked like poetry. The ritual wasn't complete until a mirror fogged with steam revealed her silhouette, and the silhouette felt worthy of being remembered. There's a documented practice, mentioned in the erotic spirit through history, where a lover would send a perfumed letter, not written on parchment, but on fabric meant to be worn under clothing. The message wasn't to be read, but inhaled. The scent, carefully curated with herbs linked to Venus and Mithra, would cling to the recipient like a ghost. If the receiver blushed upon smelling it, the spell had worked. If they sneezed, the blend needed more clove. One such cloth survives, sealed in a clay jar found in what was once a lover's tomb. The writing is illegible, but the scent still clings faintly to the threads. Dry roses, smoke, a little bitterness at the edges, and for every enchantress who mastered the arts of seduction, there were skeptics, men and women who dismissed love spells as nonsense and relied instead on confidence, poetry, and well-timed proximity. Some lovers claimed they could smell deceit on a person's skin. Others boasted of dreams so vivid they knew their soulmate before ever meeting them. Whether through incense or instinct, Persian love was rarely passive. It required action, intention, sometimes a little madness. You had to want it. You had to work for it. You had to risk waking up cursed, or worse, remembered. Remember this. In Persian love magic, the greatest spell was always risk. The willingness to chase a feeling you couldn't explain. The courage to believe that a fig leaf left on a doorstep might mean more than all the palace proclamations in the world. And in a society where most marriages were arranged and most passion punished, that risk was everything. It was how lovers carved a path through protocol. How hearts dared to beat in rhythm with something older than law, older than fear, older even than language. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the scent of rosewater mingling with cinnamon. Imagine a quiet chant rising beneath a cypress tree. Imagine someone out there, lighting a candle with your name on their lips, not calling for you, but conjuring you. And if you dream of someone tonight, don't ask why. Just follow the trail of saffron in the dark. The drum beats echo before the bride even enters. Not loud, just steady, like a heartbeat pretending not to care. You're in a courtyard strung with lanterns and silk banners the color of pomegranates split open. It smells like roasted lamb, cardamom, and something sharper, maybe. Anticipation, maybe anxiety. This is not a fairy tale wedding. This is a contract dressed in poetry. The bride's veil alone weighs nearly 5 pounds, studded with tiny lapis stones and embroidered verses that no one but her husband is supposed to read. Tonight, love wears gold bangles and legalese. Because in ancient Persia, a wedding was less about love and more about navigating family ambitions, inheritance laws, and the silent politics of linen dowries and almond harvests. That doesn't mean people didn't fall in love. It just means they had to do it carefully, strategically, often, long after the marriage itself had been signed, sealed, and stamped by a priest who probably hadn't smiled in a decade. You sit in the back, watching as the groom arrives with his entourage. He's bathed, perfumed, and more nervous than his swagger suggests. In his hand is the marriage contract, known as the Aq Dizim Hum, and it's longer than his family tree. This document doesn't just confirm the union. It outlines responsibilities, expectations, financial compensations, property rights, and, in some cases, what kind of poetry the husband is expected to recite during the first 7 nights. Yes, that was sometimes a clause, especially in literary families. The bride has a similar list, though hers is often dictated by her father or older brothers, depending on how patriarchal the household. Historians still argue whether these contracts empowered women or imprisoned them. Some point out that women could include conditions of their own requests for education, property control, even the right to divorce under specific circumstances. Others argue that such options were rare in practice and largely symbolic. The truth probably lies somewhere between the ink and the silence. Now for something spicy from the scrolls. There's a surviving contract from a noblewoman in Ecbatana who insisted her husband never bring another concubine into their home. If he did, she would be entitled to half his estate in custody of their camels, not just the children, the camels. She was clearly a woman who knew where the real assets were. The groom signed reluctantly. 2 years later, he fell for a dancer in Isfahan, brought her home, and promptly lost everything, including his prized racing camel, Madakt. The ex-wife became a legend, and Madakt, rumor has it, was paraded through the city once a year wearing silk bells and passive-aggressive tassels. Back at the wedding, the bride steps into view, veiled in gold-threaded tulle. She walks slowly, not from shyness but because she's memorized every step. Each movement matters. In some Persian regions, the bridal procession is choreographed like a ceremony of war. One misstep could be seen as a bad omen. Guests throw sugar over her path, whisper blessings, and pretend not to analyze her posture. In her shoes, there may be rose petals, or cloves, or tiny pouches of saffron sewn into the soles, to keep her steady and fragrant from the ground up. And when she finally reaches her groom, they don't kiss. That comes much, much later, maybe. If the stars approve. During the ceremony, poetry is recited not about the couple, but about love itself. Philosophical, mystical, sometimes erotic. Rumi, Hafez, Sadi. These poems are chosen to invoke divine harmony, to call in blessings from celestial forces, and occasionally to distract nosy relatives from the real tension radiating off the couple. Like summer heat, the legal scribe reads the terms. The witnesses nod, the ink dries. And suddenly, two lives are bound not by passion, but by precision. Love, if it comes, will have to slip in later, like a second guest arriving after the party's already started. You catch sight of the bride's mother, watching from a curtained alcove. Her face unreadable. Is she remembering her own wedding? Or calculating how many jars of ghee the dowry included? It's hard to tell. Marriage in Persia wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new negotiation. Between families, between the couple, between personal desire and public duty. There were rituals for everything. How to enter the bedroom, how to remove the veil, how to bathe the next morning. One royal bride reportedly refused to consummate her marriage until her husband composed a ghazal that made her cry. He wrote 37. The 38th did the trick. Let's pivot to a fringe custom. In some villages, newlyweds were sprinkled with powdered sugar by unmarried girls, while being circled 3 times by a rooster and a hen tied together by a silk thread. The symbolism was dense fertility, sweetness, and gender harmony, all wrapped up in poultry pageantry. Whether this was truly common or just a one-time village flex is up for debate, but the record exists, scribbled in the margins of an agricultural diary from 5th century Persia. Of course, not all weddings were joyfully entered. Some were arranged, with chilling detachment alliances sealed to stop blood feuds or secure trade routes. There's one account of a 13-year-old girl married to a 42-year-old tax collector in exchange for grain and olive trees. She later ran away with the village. Storyteller, they were caught. He was blinded. She was married off again, this time to a priest. But the poems he wrote for her, carved onto ceramic tiles, were later found in a crumbling bathhouse wall. One reads, "I held your name between my teeth so long, it turned to song." A small rebellion. But rebellions often start small. Interestingly, Persian law sometimes offered more flexibility than modern assumptions allow. Divorce wasn't impossible. Women could initiate it under certain terms. Some did. Others didn't, for reasons too tangled to unravel. There's a famous case where a woman filed for separation on the grounds that her husband snored in a way that disturbed the sacred rhythm of her sleep and thereby her dreams. The case was dismissed, but her complaint was immortalized in court. Records as a plea for nocturnal sanctity. Now you're at the wedding feast. Trays of jeweled rice, lamb with pomegranate glaze, and stewed apricots arrive like a royal procession. The newlyweds sit under a canopy of rose petals while guests throw walnuts and recite toasts. The bride still hasn't spoken. That will come during the unveiling, in private. Her first words to her husband are considered sacred. Sometimes they're a blessing, sometimes a threat. One bride, centuries ago, whispered, "I hope you're more interesting than your horoscope." He wasn't. She later became a patron of orphan girls and built a library of romantic epics that still bears her name. The night winds down with music-soft looping melodies played on strings and flutes. Couples dance, some in love, some pretending, some plotting their own escape routes. You step outside for air, the sound of laughter and clinking goblets fading behind you. The stars overhead look exactly the same as they did before, but something has changed. You've seen love, reframed, repackaged, ritualized. You've watched people bind their hearts with ink and ceremony, hoping passion might one day catch up. As you drift back toward your own dreams tonight, remember, in ancient Persia, marriage was the structure. Love was the smuggler. And sometimes, the smuggler got away. The candle flickers once, then twice, as if it knows a secret and isn't sure whether to keep it. You're sitting in a small stone room, quiet as a held breath, where shadows stretch like silk across the walls. This is no ordinary chamber. This is where the spiritual meets the sensual, where priests whisper advice about love with faces so serious you'd think they were discussing plague outbreaks, not pillow preferences. You've entered a space most history books avoid, the intersection of religion and intimacy, where sacred texts doubled as bedroom manuals and moral codes sometimes came with footnotes about foreplay. Tonight, we light the incense and step into the awkward, mysterious, and surprisingly poetic world of priestly pillow talk in ancient Persia. You might assume the clergy had no business in matters of the bed. But oh, how wrong you'd be. In ancient Zoroastrian Persia, spiritual purity wasn't just about washing your hands before prayer. Extended to every corner of domestic life, including what happened under the covers. Priests were expected to guide not just public virtue, but private behavior, offering counsel on everything from marriage harmony to, yes, how often couples should come together to align with cosmic order. And their opinions? Not always what you'd expect. One priestly guide from the Achaemenid period suggests that abstaining from sex for too long might invite disorder of the soul and dreams of insects. Interpret that how you will. Here's where things get both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. Many spiritual leaders advised newlyweds through personalized ceremonies that blended prayer with practical instruction. Imagine this, you're a bride on your wedding night. After a long day of ceremonial fasting, gold-threaded veils, and polite smiling at in-laws you'll never trust, a temple priest appears with a scroll. Not to bless you, but to explain gently and with serious eye contact how best to honor your husband's flame. The language is metaphorical, but the intent is crystal clear. One text even recommends positioning advice based on planetary alignments, with Venus-favored nights deemed more fruitful and affectionate. Historians still argue whether these guides were read aloud or handed over discreetly, but either way, they existed. And someone had to write them, and yet, the priests weren't all dry instruction and cosmic caution. Some were accidental poets. One manual describes marital intimacy as the mingling of two sacred fires, seeking warmth without consuming each other. Another suggests soft laughter and praise before touch, as a way to honor the divine within one's partner. It's not Kama Sutra level graphic, but it's still surprisingly tender, especially when you consider the same texts also contain curses against lice and protocols for handling goat theft. Now let's meet a real character, Mobd Ardashir, a high-ranking Zoroastrian priest known not just for his theological brilliance, but for his infamous premarital consultation sessions. Surviving letters describe his three-veil method for ensuring spiritual consent and physical comfort. The couple would sit on opposite sides of a curtain, speak through a second veil, and finally touch fingertips through a third before the ceremony. This process, he claimed, aligned the soul's fire before the body followed. Romantic? Maybe. Ridiculously elaborate? Absolutely. But he believed it prevented post-marital regret. One cynical court poet wrote a parody of his method involving 7 veils, a talking goat, and a priest who fell in love with himself during the ritual. It was banned, of course, but not before copies were smuggled out, stitched into the linings of pillowcases. Fringe fact incoming. Some priestly advisors believed incense blends could influence the emotional tone of a couple's first night. Frankincense for peace, myrrh for fertility, cinnamon for passion, and something called dragon's tongue resin for eloquence, so you didn't accidentally blurt out the wrong name at a crucial moment. One preserved altar fragment contains what appears to be a recipe for a pre-love fumigation spell. 3 puffs toward the east, 1 toward her heart, and 1 last into your own sleeve, to remember humility. Practical? Maybe. Ridiculously poetic? Always, but not all was divine. Fragrance and cosmic alignment. There were tensions. Some priests grew suspicious of couples who seemed too joyous too often. One infamous case involved the couple brought before the temple council for excessive laughter after sundown. The charges were eventually dropped, but not before. An anonymous neighbor left a poem on their doorstep that read, "If your joy wakes the moon thrice in a week, expect the stars to blink." A burn, in ancient Persian verse form. You're now seated in a small lecture hall, stone benches, scroll racks, and a faint smell of melted wax. This is where apprentice priests learn to navigate the awkward terrain of moral instruction. The first scroll they study, not a theological treatise, but a guide to empathic listening for nuptial inquiries. That's right, step one to priesthood was learning how to talk about intimacy without blushing, or laughing, or running away. Some failed. One dropout became a wandering juggler. His act included reciting failed wedding blessings while balancing love letters on his nose. He was weirdly popular at spring festivals. Now for a tale that sticks in the teeth, like honey-soaked almonds. A young couple once sought advice from a famed temple sage, known for his long silences and longer beard. They asked how to avoid jealousy, and he reportedly handed them 2 spoons, one silver, one wooden. "Stir from your own pot," he said, "but taste from hers." No one quite knows what it meant. Some say it was a metaphor for mutual intimacy. Others think it was just a cryptic way of saying, "Mind your business." Either way, the couple named their first child Spoon. True story. But even with all this priestly advice, not everyone obeyed. Some lovers ran wild beneath the surface of the sacred. Hidden rendezvous in temple gardens. Coded messages slipped into hymn lyrics. One priest's wife allegedly met her lover during confession sessions, using phrases like, "I have sinned through longing," as euphemism for "meet me by the olive tree." When discovered, she claimed spiritual possession. The case was never resolved. But local boys started writing "olive tree" on their sandals as a joke, and sometimes as an invitation. What becomes clear, as the candle burns lower, is this: the line between sacred and sensual was never clear-cut. In Persian culture, desire wasn't always dirty. It was divine mischief, something to be channeled, not crushed. Priests weren't the enemies of love, they were its awkward translators. Their scrolls and rituals didn't stifle passion, they gave it structure, rhythm, a script for those too nervous to improvise. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a room filled with smoke and scripture. A priest reciting verses about stars and longing. A couple lighting candles not just to see each other, but to honor the spark between them. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there still prays for love like that. Not perfect, not purified, just real. The candlelight is low, and the air smells like roasted walnuts and secrets. You're crouched behind a curtain in the back of a merchant's house. But don't worry, this isn't a raid. It's a love story in disguise. You've just entered the world of ancient Persian lovers and camouflage cross-dressers, code switchers, and undercover poets who risked everything for a single touch, a whispered name, or the flick of a fan behind the wrong door. This isn't a palace tale or a holy ritual. This is love off the record, in disguise, in danger, and more inventive than a dozen dynasties. So tighten your scarf, check your aliases, and don't speak unless you mean it. Because in this chapter, your name might be a lie, but your heart won't be. Let's start with the art of deception, because when your love could cost you your status, your family, or your head, you learn to get creative. Lovers wore each other's clothes, switched jewelry to signal meetings, and used names like the fig seller or the one with the lemon voice in public, even if one of them was a nobleman and the other a seamstress posing as a tea-boy. Masks weren't common, but veils, oh, the veils. They became multi-layered metaphors, both literal and poetic, a canvas for secrets and seductions. One legend tells of a merchant's daughter who dressed as a soldier for 3 years just to follow the man she loved across provinces. She never revealed her identity. Instead, she wrote him letters signed "Your Shadow," and left them inside his boots. He never discovered her secret, but he never married anyone else. Historians still debate whether this was devotion or delusion, but the boots at least were real. Cross-dressing wasn't just subterfuge, it was performance, sometimes even fashion. In city festivals, men and women would swap roles for the day, using the pretense of celebration to explore gender. Lines without consequence. One ancient court painter, known only as Samir, captured an image of a queen's maid dressed in the Shah's hunting robes, holding a falcon and grinning like she knew something no one else did. That miniature was quietly removed from the archives. Decades later, but not before several copies were made. It still circulates in underground art circles, often mislabeled as the Falcon Bride. The symbolism? Deliberate, sharp, unapologetic. Let's now meet a pair known in hushed legend as Mer and Arezu, both women, both daughters of rival spice traders. They met during a midsummer harvest when they were 12, and the world never quite recovered. Their families, sensing danger, separated them. But every autumn festival, one of them would dress as a boy, sneak into the other's household disguised as a kitchen apprentice, and recite poems while slicing quinces. These weren't just love poems, they were strategic, laced with insight jokes and obscure metaphors only they understood. One poem described a garden where figs wept and bees refused honey. Another referenced a certain footstep on a stair that creaked only when a promise was broken. When their relationship was eventually discovered, they were exiled separately. But Arezu is said to have dyed her horse's mane the color of Mer's favorite saffron veil. For months afterward, travelers along that road claimed they saw flashes of gold streaking through the hills like a comet that refused to burn out. And this brings us to the role of poetry again. Because when words could get you caught, coded verse became both a shield and a sword. Lovers in ancient Persia wrote under pen names, reversed the gender of their subjects, or described desire through objects. A lamp that won't go out, a cup that overflows, a door that never opens from the inside. One poet, likely a eunuch in royal service, became infamous for verses that always ended with the line, "But I have no name here." His identity was never revealed, but fragments of his work were found scribbled in the margins of shipping ledgers and hymnals, almost as if love refused to stay in the spaces it was given. Quirky detail for your dreams. Tonight, some clandestine lovers used birds to communicate. Trained partridges or nightingales were taught to fly between balconies, carrying silk-wrapped notes or even small rings. One court record notes a nobleman who tried to sue his neighbor for emotional disturbance by bird. The case was dropped, but the phrase stuck and was later used in a satirical play where two lovers trained a raven to insult their parents in rhyme so they could sneak off during the chaos. Art imitating life, or life just trying to stay ahead of the censors? Even more fringe, there's evidence that some women trained their maids to act as doubles. If a suitor came calling at the wrong time, the maid, dressed and perfumed like her mistress, would entertain him just long enough for the real lover to escape or arrive. These swaps weren't just logistical, they were psychological theater. One traveler wrote of meeting a woman in Ray whose voice was like two mirrors talking to each other. No one could ever confirm who he'd actually met. Which of course was the point. And in the middle of all this artifice, real feelings bloomed, sometimes painfully. One eunuch wrote of loving a concubine so completely that he disguised himself as her chambermaid just to be near her, braiding her hair and listening to her talk about other men. When he was eventually discovered, he didn't apologize. He just said, "I was always meant to be her mirror." The line was recorded, then scratched out by a court censor. But you can still read it if the parchment is held up to the right light. Now imagine the nerves, the adrenaline, the sheer daring it took to be someone else in order to love someone truly. These weren't casual flings. These were high-wire acts over pits of social ruin, and yet people did it, over and over. Because sometimes to reach the one you love, you had to become someone else, just long enough to get there. So tonight, as you drift off, ask yourself, if you had to steal a name, a voice, a face just to hold on to the person who made the world make sense, would you? In ancient Persia, the answer was almost always yes. And somewhere in a hidden line of poetry, or a carved locket buried in dust, that yes is still echoing. The corridor you're walking down feels colder than it should, not because of any draft, but because the silence here is curated thick, ceremonial. You're about to enter the world of the eunuchs. Not as a visitor, not really, you're a ghost. Here, invisible and unnoticed, slipping between whispers and doorways, trying to understand how those who were cut from the game of desire ended up knowing every player's move. Because in ancient Persia, eunuchs weren't just bystanders. They were archivists of secrets, architects of influence, and in many cases, the final authority on who got to love whom, and how long they got to keep it. The term guardian of the harem might sound polite, almost quaint. But these were the eyes and ears of the palace, the watchers in silk, the sentinels of touch, the men who were no longer men, and so became something far more dangerous. Now, let's back up. In case you're picturing awkward middle-aged guards with keys and bad posture, think again. Persian eunuchs were often educated from childhood, fluent in poetry, military code, court etiquette, and emotional surveillance. Some were born into servitude, others captured in battle or sold into it, and some even volunteered seeking advancement in a world that would never give it to them otherwise. Their roles were paradoxical. Stripped of sexual agency, they became power brokers in the most intimate corners of royal life. And because they were presumed to be safe, they were trusted, not just by kings but by queens, concubines, courtiers. That trust, of course, was a fiction, because no one forgets who they were before the blade. And in the quiet between rituals, many eunuchs found other ways to be seen. Take the tale of Jahandar, a eunuch from the court of Darius II, who reportedly orchestrated the downfall of two rival concubines, simply by reassigning their favorite musicians to opposing wings of the palace. Within weeks, jealousy bloomed like mold. Arguments erupted during moonlit bath times, and a heated towel dispute escalated into a full-blown scandal. Jahandar, he just watched. And when the king asked which woman was more devout, Jahandar offered a carefully rehearsed poem about still water and muddy wine. Historians still argue whether the line was poetic or petty. But the concubine who won the king's favor kept Jahandar as her personal advisor until the day she died. Let's linger here for a moment, because it's important. Eunuchs weren't blank slates. Many developed rich emotional worlds, quiet, coded, and fiercely private. Some wrote poetry under pen names, crafting verses so full of longing they made even the hardened generals pause. Others acted as confidants to lovers who couldn't speak openly, delivering messages between veils, editing love notes to make them appropriate, then slipping in their own anonymous lines for flavor. One eunuch is rumored to have kept a secret archive, a collection of unmailed letters, unsigned gifts, and pressed flowers from romances that never fully bloomed. The archive was supposedly buried with him, but every few decades, someone claims to have found a piece of it, a ribbon, a poem, a comb with a name carved in a language no longer spoken. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry into your dreams. Some eunuchs were known to adopt cats, not just as pets, but as delivery tools. They'd train them to carry silk-wrapped scrolls from one window to another, using meat-scented trails and scheduled routines. One cat, named Gulbahar, became so effective at this that a jealous concubine reportedly poisoned it with fig wine. The resulting heartbreak led to a temporary truce between three rival factions in the harem, united in mourning. A poem was even composed. She walked without sin, tail high in secrets. May her paws find peace among the stars. People wore amulets shaped like her for years, But not all eunuch tales were whispered elegies. Some found ways to assert themselves, to manipulate. Not just affection but politics. One rose to the rank of chief diplomat, negotiating treaties between provinces while quietly shaping the marriage alliances that held empires together. Another acted as the Shah's tester of affections, a strange title that meant he was responsible for determining whether a rumored affair was genuine or just strategic flirting. His method? Hosting a feast, mixing specific aphrodisiac ingredients into the food, and observing reactions. If cheeks flushed and glances lingered longer than 7 breaths, he'd report the affair as active. If not, he marked it dormant. Either way, lives changed. Eunuchs also knew the choreography of the harem better than anyone. Who walked where, when? Who lingered by which door? Who wept too long in the garden? Who smiled a little too quickly at which lute player? They carried scented linens, arranged bath times, selected jewelry, and matched lovers with music like it was alchemy. But they weren't just logistics managers. They were emotional cartographers. They saw patterns, predicted heartbreaks, and sometimes, just sometimes, prevented them. Of course, some fell in love, quietly, painfully. There's a story of a eunuch who loved a scholar's apprentice, gifting him dried rose petals folded into origami cranes. The apprentice accepted them, not knowing their origin. He burned them during a ritual meant to forget unrequited desires. The eunuch watched the ashes scatter from a distance and wrote a single line in the dust of his chamber wall. Love without witness burns cleanest. That line later appeared uncited in a famous court poet's anthology. The eunuch received no credit, but those who knew, and what of their sexuality? It's a question modern minds often stumble over. Some eunuchs were celibate, yes, but others found intimacy in unconventional forms through letters, touches that lingered 1 second too long, shared silences beneath a tapestry. One scholar argued that Persian eunuchs developed a vocabulary of longing so precise it could shatter porcelain. Another dismissed them entirely as political tools. But most agree they knew love. Maybe not the kind sanctioned by palace scrolls, but the kind that leaves echoes. Let's finish with a final tale. In the reign of Artaxerxes I, a eunuch named Samander was said to be the only person the queen truly trusted. He arranged her correspondence, chose her dancers, and once took a beating in her place when a jealous cousin accused her of improper conduct. He never denied or confirmed the rumors. When he died, she had him buried beside the fig tree she once kissed her first lover beneath. On his gravestone, no titles. Just one line, carved in careful hand. He saw every door but asked for none. So, tonight, as you drift off beneath your own ceiling of quiet shadows, think of the watchers. The ones who weren't allowed to love openly, but who loved anyway. The ones who stitched their hearts into the seams of royal robes, fed birds with secrets, and made themselves invisible so others could be seen. In the world of Persian love, the loudest hearts often beat behind the quietest eyes. The ink on your fingers isn't dry yet, and already you feel like you've touched something forbidden. It smells faintly of jasmine oil and iron, like secrets, wrapped in silk and nailed to a palace wall. You're not in a scriptorium, you're in the backroom of desire, where calligraphy becomes confession and ink stains are the only proof love ever existed. Welcome to the world of scribes of passion, the anonymous artists and ghostwriters of Persian longing. They didn't just copy documents. They curated emotion, disguised affairs in metaphor, and bound whole heartbreaks in 10 lines or fewer. In a society where saying the wrong name aloud could get you exiled or worse, writing became the ultimate seduction. And the pen? The most dangerous lover of all. You hear it before you see it, the scratch of reed pens over parchment, soft and desperate, like a kiss that doesn't know if it will be returned. Here, in the corners of courts and merchant houses, poets and scribes carried out emotional espionage. A good scribe could make you fall in love with someone you'd never touched. A great one could do it in under 6 couplets. Persian court culture was obsessed with literary flair. Love wasn't announced with shouting. It was revealed in meter, rhythm, allusion, clever twists of metaphor. These were the currency of the heart. You didn't say, "I want you." You wrote, "Even the candle envies your light." And if your handwriting slanted too boldly, it was assumed your passion burned ungovernably. Now imagine this. A young prince, recently betrothed, finds himself drawn not to his bride, but to her chambermaid, a girl who once spilled rosewater on his boots and apologized with a smirk. He can't speak to her, not openly, but he can commission a poem. He hires a palace scribe to compose a verse about unreachable gardens and stubborn stars. The scribe, cleverer than most, adds a few coded references to spilled perfume and silver buttons. The poem is accidentally dropped in the maid's laundry basket. 3 days later, the prince finds a handkerchief embroidered with the last line of the verse. He keeps it hidden in his sleeve for the next 5 years. They never touch. But every time he smells rosewater, he smiles. Historians still debate whether the story is real or just another poet's revenge fantasy. But the poem? It exists. It's tucked into a scroll fragment, filed under miscellaneous devotions. This wasn't rare. Emotional ghostwriting was a thriving trade. Some scribes worked under patronage, composing love letters for royals and nobles too busy or illiterate to express themselves. Others operated in the shadows, slipping drafts under doors for desperate lovers, like romantic black market dealers. The best among them had signature styles. One always ended with water metaphors, another with veiled threats of reincarnation. Payment varied. A silk robe, a jar of honey, a favor owed in winter. Occasionally, a knight. One famed scribe gender, unknown, was so skilled at mimicking others' voices that 5 lovers once fell in love with each other without ever having met. Their letters crisscrossed for months. When the truth came out, they didn't stop writing. They just gave the scribe a name, beloved. Quirk alert. Some Persian scribes wrote with ink scented to match the mood of the message. Lavender for apology. Sandalwood for seduction. Clove and citrus for jealousy. One rare blend, known only as ashen violet, was said to induce dreams of the writer's face. Whether that's science or superstition is anyone's guess, but one courtier claimed he dreamed of the same scribe every night for a year, only to find a poem under his pillow the morning after the dream stopped. It simply read, "We were." Words, not bodies. That was always the point. Even more tantalizing, erotic manuscripts written entirely in metaphor. These weren't salacious, they were symphonic. A candle melting too fast, a river breaking its banks, a falcon landing where it shouldn't. One text, known only as the Orange Book, described a love affair through fruit metaphors so layered that modern scholars still debate which ones represent mouths and which ones represent ... other things. It's currently locked in a university archive, available only by special request and a written justification, which frankly feels very on brand. Let's talk about calligraphy itself. Because in Persia, handwriting was an extension of the soul. Letters weren't just vehicles, they were performances. The curve of a stroke could reveal longing, hesitation, arrogance. Some lovers judged sincerity by the tilt of a letter. If the tail of a particular character looped too tightly, it meant the writer was insecure, too loose, and they were careless. There were treatises on this stuff, entire schools of thought devoted to romantic graphology. One poet claimed he could tell if someone would make a faithful lover by the way they drew the letter mim. His theory? Passion always curls inward, and what of the scrolls that didn't survive? Burned, hidden, buried with their authors. There's a legend about a scroll library built entirely for rejected poems, verses too raw, too dangerous, too real to be shared. It was supposedly constructed in a hollowed-out cypress tree in the mountains near Yazd, no one's found it. But every so often, hikers report hearing whispers in the wind, fragments of verse that don't belong to any known poet. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe love just refuses to stay buried. Let's not ignore the danger, either. Writing about love, especially for someone outside your class, gender, or religion, could get you exiled, mutilated, or killed. One scribe, accused of composing verses for a princess promised to a rival kingdom, was sentenced to have his tongue removed. Before the sentence was carried out, he wrote one final poem with his blood. The last line? "Let silence speak where breath cannot." The executioner spared him. The scroll was sealed in a silver box and placed under the princess's pillow. The night she left for her wedding, she took it with her. Never returned. But for every story that ends in ruin, there are those that linger like perfume, unresolved, unbroken. A scarf embroidered with a single word. A poem tucked into a shoe. A line of ink faded into fabric that still pulses under moonlight. These weren't just letters. They were acts of resistance, invitations to feel, blueprints of possibility in a world that demanded restraint. So tonight, as you lie there in the half-light, think of the scribes, the ones who risked everything to put someone else's heartbeat on paper. The ones who stitched desire into the curve of a letter. The ones who made lovers out of strangers and made longing last longer than the bodies who felt it. In ancient Persia, love didn't just live in kisses or glances. It lived in ink. And it's still there, somewhere, waiting for someone to read between the lines. Steam curls around your face like a secret, not quite spoken, warm and thick and perfumed with eucalyptus, mint, and the faint trace of something sweeter, musk, maybe, or the memory of someone's skin. You're not alone, but you're not being watched either. This is the Persian hammam, the ancient bathhouse where the body meets the spirit, and both shed their armor. Beneath domed ceilings and trickling fountains, the rituals of cleanliness and pleasure blend until they're indistinguishable. And tonight, you've wandered in not for hygiene, but for history. Because this is where lovers met without meeting, where a dropped towel could mean 1,000 things, and where even the walls knew better than to repeat what they'd heard. The hammam was never just a bath. It was a performance, a negotiation, a whispered promise in steam. Men and women bathed separately, of course, though in some border provinces and among certain social classes, the lines blurred. The spaces themselves were architectural seduction. Mosaic floors warm from heated channels beneath. Ceilings carved with star-shaped skylights that let in just enough light to turn water into mirrors. Inside, everything was designed to soften you. The heat opened pores and boundaries. The massage scrubbers, known as kiskses, needed not just muscle, but emotion. People didn't just relax here. They confessed. They touched. They watched each other without guilt, because everyone was equally exposed, and no one was supposed to notice. But notice they did. One story tells of a prince who fell in love with a hammam boy, not for his body, but for the way he poured water, slow and symmetrical, like poetry in motion. The prince returned week after week, never speaking, always choosing the same corner, leaving an extra coin folded in a wet towel. The boy never acknowledged him until one day, he poured the water in the opposite direction, toward the prince instead of away. That was the signal. What happened after is unclear, but the prince began writing poems about mirror pools and the hands that guide them. His father banned public poetry for a year. Historians still debate whether it was because of the scandal or because the poems were just too good. Let's pause for a juicy aside. In some hammams, lovers passed notes by wrapping them in soap slivers. The soaps, infused with herbs and oils, were given as gifts between clients and attendants. A particular scent meant, "I'm interested." Another meant, "Meet me after." One infamous blend, cinnamon, amber, and lemon leaf, was banned in 3 cities because it became associated with illicit rendezvous. They called it scent of the second hour, referring to the part of the bath session when most people stopped scrubbing and started lingering. Some even claim a certain nobleman's downfall began with the discovery of a soap packet in the wrong bath basket. Whether that's politics or perfume paranoia, who's to say? Bathhouse etiquette was strict, but pliable. Talking was minimal. Eye contact subtle. Accidental touches, always calculated. A well-timed foot brush could launch an entire affair. And yet, the hammam also functioned as a safe space, particularly for women. It was where they could drop their rolls, their veils, their practiced smiles. They sang old songs, shared midwives' gossip, and taught each other the arts of love, how to scent the wrists, how to write poetry on skin with turmeric paste, how to choose a husband by watching how he cupped his hands under running water. One woman, known only as Behar, was rumored to host secret classes in the steam room, teaching literate concubines to read love poems and compose their own. The Shah's youngest wife was among her students. When Behar was discovered, she was banished, but left behind a verse scratched into a tile. My steam will find you even after my breath is gone. Here's something for your trivia brain. Hammams often had acoustic quirks. Domes that carried whispers from one side of the room to another. Lovers used this to their advantage, placing themselves carefully so that a message spoken in one corner would be heard only by the intended ear. One architectural text refers to this as whisper geometry, a design feature allegedly discovered by accident when a jealous wife heard her husband flirting with a masseuse 3 domes away. The hammam was shut down for structural repairs. It reopened with a redesigned ceiling and a new no-talking policy that lasted exactly 5 days. And then there were the rituals. Bathing wasn't a one-step affair, it was a slow, layered ceremony. First the dry room, where you adjusted to the temperature and applied scented clay masks. Then the warm room, where attendants poured water over you and scrubbed every inch with mitts made from tree bark and silk. Then the hot room, where you sat in silence, letting the sweat draw out not just dirt, but secrets. Finally, the cooling chamber, where towels were scented with rosewater and lemon rind, and where you could be handed a letter, or a glance, or a fruit so ripe it dripped down your wrist before you could even bite it. A favorite story among scribes. A high priest once entered a hammam and emerged with a new understanding of mercy. Why? Because while being bathed by a stranger, he heard a girl 2 domes away recite a love poem that wasn't meant for him, but that unstitched him all the same. He never saw her face, but he changed the law that had forbidden servants from learning poetry. Let them feel, he said. If they must serve, let them love too. A controversial move, but it stuck. The bathhouse became a little louder. After that, let's not forget the presence of the musk poets, men and women hired not just to scrub or wash, but to recite verses while working. Their job was to relax the body and stimulate the imagination. Some used classical texts, others composed on the spot. One such poet, Leila of Kashan, was known for her soft voice and brutal honesty. Her massages came with unsolicited romantic advice, often delivered mid-scrub. If he doesn't write you by the 3rd night, she once said to a grieving bride, wash him from your skin. The bride laughed, then cried, then left with a new poem scratched onto her sandal. 3 nights is enough for fire to decide if it wants to burn. By now, your skin is warm and your thoughts a little loose. You understand what the hammam was, a place of transition. Between public and private, between cleanliness and sensuality, between who you pretended to be and who you might become. It was a world of fog and fragrance, where people could get closer without speaking, where the line between love and ritual blurred just enough to become interesting. So tonight, as you close your eyes, feel the steam rising. Hear the soft splash of water on stone. Imagine the warmth of hands that know your story before you tell it. In ancient Persia, love was sometimes loud, but more often, It was whispered into steam, and only the hammam remembers. The desert wind doesn't whisper. Sings. Long breathy vowels dragged across sand dunes, carrying stories older than the bricks in Babylon. You're bundled in layered linen, squinting against the sun as your camel lurches forward, unimpressed by the gravity of your journey. You've left the palaces behind, stepped out of the temples, and now you're following the trails of those who loved without shelter, without script, without strategy. This is the land of caravan kisses and oasis rendezvous, where longing had no audience but the stars and no alibi except distance. In ancient Persia, some of the most unforgettable love affairs weren't woven into court records. They were carved into cliffsides, murmured into tent walls, or blown across the dunes with spices and silk. Welcome to the love stories of the road. The Silk Road was not just a commercial artery, it was a living thing, pulsing with music, gossip, and an overwhelming aroma of dried apricots, camel sweat, and accidental seduction. Caravans stopped at oases like pilgrims pausing at shrines. Between bartering and rest, strangers locked eyes over steaming lentil stew, exchanged names that might not have been real, and sometimes disappeared into the same tent without ever learning each other's language. Romance here didn't unfold in scrolls or petals. It thrived in gestures, in the way someone handed you a bowl, or adjusted your scarf against the chill, or returned a borrowed water pouch tied with a knot only lovers used. There's a story from a caravanserai just outside Kerman. A merchant, married and respectable, met a dancer traveling with a troupe bound for Samarkand. She had a birthmark shaped like a scorpion on her shoulder and refused to dance to songs composed by men. He offered her almonds soaked in wine. She recited him a poem about birds that migrate too early and freeze mid-flight. They spent one night together under a date tree, sharing warmth and nonsense and promises they didn't intend to keep. When he left, he carved a line into the tree trunk. She walked like a question I was too afraid to ask. The tree died, eventually, but locals say it bloomed strangely every spring. Historians still argue if this is folklore, metaphor, or just the desert being dramatic. It wasn't always romantic, though. The road was dangerous. Bandits, disease, heat. Sometimes you fell in love just because someone had water when you didn't, or knew how to boil cactus without bitterness. Affection formed fast and deep, like lightning before a sandstorm, intense, beautiful, and always fleeting. One scribe documented a healer who fell in love with a wounded guard while treating his arrow wound. She sang to him in a dialect he didn't understand. He called her the storm because of the way her hair whipped around her face. When he healed, he left with another caravan. She marked the date by mixing his blood collected on a cloth with pomegranate ink and adding a line to her ledger: love bled. Not bad for a Tuesday. Fringe detail incoming. Some travelers wore what were called memory necklaces, beads carved with initials or images that told the story of past lovers. A palm, a drop, a crescent moon. Each bead was added after a goodbye. One particularly infamous trader wore 37 beads. When asked, he claimed only one had been worth keeping. But I lost her near Nishapur, gave her my sandals, got a fever, it was a good day. He died in bulk, still wearing the necklace. It was passed to his daughter, who reportedly added one final bead. A question mark. Language was a barrier, but also an aphrodisiac. Love on the road was spoken in glances, in shared bread, in invented signs. One common gesture involved folding your scarf into a triangle before tying it, a symbol that meant, "I'll wait for you one night." Another involved touching your chest with your right hand and blinking slowly twice. It meant roughly, "I see you, even if I shouldn't." Not everyone understood the code, but those who did never forgot it. Poets of the road were different from court poets, less refined, more visceral. They recited from memory, swapped verses like currency, and tattooed lines onto their forearms in case they forgot. One famous caravan bard named Khusro would perform love epics at fire pits, inserting local names into his stories, making strangers feel immortal for the night. Love, he'd say, is the sand in your shoes, annoying, persistent, but proof that you walked somewhere that mattered. He died in a dust storm, and his last words reportedly were, "Tell her I didn't look back." Let's pause for a poetic relic. Archaeologists once uncovered a clay shard inscribed with a love letter in cuneiform, buried near a caravanserai outside Yazd. It read, "I touched the place where you sat. It was warm. My hands are liars now." It's on display in a museum, but locals believe it's cursed. Whoever reads it aloud will dream of a lost lover and wake with dry lips. Tourists try it anyway. Most say the dreams are worth it, but for all the transient affairs, some caravan romances stuck. There's a tale of two mapmakers, one Persian, one Greek, who met on the road, fell in love over terrain disputes, and traveled together for 20 years. They charted stars and scars, writing notes and margins about kisses mistaken for compass points. Their maps include markings like possible oasis, she laughed here, and danger zone, he almost said forever. No one knows their real names, but their work still circulates among amateur historians and hopeless romantics. One map even made it into a military archive, although no one can explain why Heart-Shaped Valley is labeled in 3 languages. Sometimes lovers promise to meet again after a set number of moons. A soldier once agreed to return to a musician after 7 cycles. He missed it by 2. She'd already married. But every full moon, she'd play their song on the edge of the oasis, hoping he might still be listening. He was, from afar, hidden, because love doesn't always ask to be forgiven. Just remember dot in one of the letters. Many wrote them. Few sent them. Some were buried in sand, others burned in ceremonial silence. But the act of writing them, of forming the words with cracked ink and tired fingers, was often enough. One letter never mailed reads, "If I knew your name, I would give it to the wind. Let it carry you back to me in pieces." So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the desert quiet, the stars overhead blinking like secrets too shy to speak. Feel the dust on your lips, the weight of longing wrapped in linen. In ancient Persia, love didn't just bloom in palaces. It crossed deserts on sore feet and saddle sores, whispered from tent to tent, and disappeared with the dawn, leaving behind only footprints and metaphors. And sometimes that was enough. You hear them before you see them, soft laughter laced with tension, the rustle of silk robes, and the unmistakable clink of gold bangles that don't sound celebratory, they sound competitive. You're not in the spice market, and this isn't some innocent tea gathering. You've just stepped into the royal quarters, deep within a Persian palace, where the women aren't just beautiful. They're strategic, sharp, and deadly good at reading the political weather. These aren't helpless wives or passive concubines, lounging on embroidered pillows. No, these are players in a long game of power, favor, and survival. Welcome to the census of touch, the invisible hierarchy of Persian love that measured affection in glances, power in perfumes, and legacy in WOMBS. Tonight, the scent of jasmine is thick, almost too thick. Not romantic, it's tactical. A signal, because tonight, the Shah will choose whom to visit. That's not a random act of affection. It's a political decision, a social domino. One woman will rise. The others will sulk, scheme, or seduce their way back into relevance. You're witnessing a system so intricate that even the cushions have memories and the wine cups know who's been favored lately. In the harem, affection wasn't free. It was rationed, recorded, and very much WEAPONIZ. Start with the basics. The royal women were categorized with a precision that would make a modern HR department blush. At the top sat the chief wife, often chosen for noble blood, fertility, and political alliances. Below her were junior wives, official concubines, and finally, the unranked favorites, sometimes dancers, sometimes poets, sometimes women whose only weapon was their astonishing unpredictability. They all lived together, ate together, and in many cases, competed like athletes for the most coveted prize: proximity. Not love, access. And what was this access worth? Influence over court appointments, the ability to secure positions for brothers and sons, the right to dictate the decor of the royal pavilion. Even the scheduling of royal ceremonies could hinge on whose lap the king had warmed the night before. One queen reportedly delayed a military campaign by faking a fainting spell during the Shah's dressing ritual. It worked. The battle never happened. She was later gifted an orchard. But this wasn't a simple sex for status transaction. Persian royal culture was layered. Being chosen didn't guarantee longevity. Many women were chosen once and forgotten forever, consigned to quieter chambers and endless embroidery. Others, never chosen, became advisors, confidants, even conspirators. One concubine named Nilofar was said to be so adept at interpreting the Shah's dreams that he consulted her before every major decision, yet he never touched her. When she died, he ordered a poem inscribed into her tomb: "You never laid beside me, yet you lay beside my thoughts." The court didn't know what to make of that. Some said she was a witch. Others said she was the only woman he ever feared. Let's slip into one chamber now, low light, bronze mirrors, and two women pretending not to watch each other. One is brushing her hair with deliberate slowness. The other is polishing a silver ring, knowing full well its gemstone used to belong to a rival. They won't speak. But everything here is conversation. The way they sit, the angle of their eyebrows, the amount of rosewater in their tea. You're watching a chess game played without pieces, just glances and gossip. And tonight, they'll both send a message to the Shah, not a letter. A gesture. One will gift him a pair of embroidered slippers that match his falcon's feathers. The other will hum a lullaby from his mother's province while walking past his chamber. Both will be remembered. Only one will be invited. Fringe fact for the insomniacs: some Persian harems reportedly had weekly affection audits. No joke. Scribes kept logs of who was summoned, how long the visit lasted, and whether the woman emerged with gifts, songs, or silence. These records, while not public, influenced everything from kitchen rations to tailoring orders. One historian claims to have seen a wax tablet noting Zara third night this week, apricot perfume again, possible pregnancy. Another tablet more ominous, Faradeno summons in 12 moons, mood volatile. And here's a haunting detail for your dreams. Some women, aware that they might never be chosen again, stage their own farewells. A performance. A last night. One concubine filled her chamber with jasmine petals and sang her favorite love poem backward. A symbolic act of unbinding. She lit sandalwood incense, bathed alone, and slept facing the east, the direction of her home village. She wasn't seen again. No drama, no exile, just disappearance. Rumors say she joined a temple. Others believe she became a shadow advisor to the queen. But the scent of sandalwood still makes the guards nervous. And what of affection itself? Was it real? Did the Shah actually love any of these women? Did they love him? Historians still argue. Some kings wrote poems that suggest genuine tenderness. Others treated their harem like a spice rack sampling, rotating, discarding. But the women weren't always victims. They maneuvered. Some loved fiercely, others strategically. One junior wife, Mahen, was said to whisper the name of her true lover, an architect, every night while lying beside the king. The architect knew. He designed her private garden so that the stone pathways spelled out verses of their hidden romance when viewed from above. He was never caught. She was never suspected. But when she died, she requested to be buried with a small chisel. just in case she needed to carve a message on the other side. Let's not forget the children. Bearing a royal son changed everything. It could elevate a concubine to near equal status with the queen, but it also put a target on her back. Poisonings, accidents, mysterious illnesses. Motherhood was not a safety net. It was a lightning rod. One woman allegedly fed her son rose petals soaked in goat's milk every morning to sweeten his fate. He died at 10. She vanished, but her room remained sealed for 50 years, untouched, the scent of rose lingering long after. And in the quiet corners of this labyrinth, love still tried to survive. Between women, between servants and guards, between reality and memory. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't, but always it mattered. Even the most calculating concubines had one drawer, one scarf, one verse tucked away for a person they weren't supposed to miss. So as you sink deeper into sleep, remember this. The census of touch was never just about who was chosen. It was about who remembered, who plotted, who forgave. In ancient Persia, love wasn't always soft. Sometimes it wore gold, sometimes it held a dagger, and sometimes it smiled just long enough to make you believe it meant it. It starts with a smell sharp, earthy, oddly hopeful. You're standing in the corner of a bustling apothecary tucked between a tannery and a carpet stall, and something in the air is making your thoughts misbehave. Is it the cardamom, the frankincense, the roasted onion slivers soaking in date syrup? You can't tell, but your skin suddenly feels more alive than usual. Welcome to the aphrodisiac economy of ancient Persia, where love was brewed, bottled, and sometimes boiled into oblivion. Where passion didn't just bloom in hearts, it fermented in clay pots, simmered in goat fat, and sometimes arrived with a receipt. You're about to explore a marketplace that sold desire like silk, where what you ate, drank, and smeared onto your body wasn't just for pleasure, it was for power. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Persians didn't invent aphrodisiacs, but they elevated the practice into high art. Physicians, poets, cooks, and charlatans alike claimed to know which foods inflamed longing, softened rejection, or made you forget the sound of someone else's name. There were categories: heating spices for attraction, cooling herbs for stamina, bitters for heartache, sweets for surrender. Love, according to one 11th century manuscript, was a matter of internal temperature. Desire is a fire, it read, and every fire hungers differently. First up in this spicy symphony, pistachios. Known as the smiling nut. Yes, that's real. Pistachios were believed to increase vitality, especially when paired with warm wine and recited verse. One courtier allegedly ate 3 handfuls before every diplomatic meeting, not because he expected romance, but because it made my words taste better. Then there's saffron, which, aside from dyeing everything it touched, was believed to enhance arousal and chase away melancholy. Women sometimes tucked threads of it into their undergarments. Men drank it steeped in rose water with honey. One scribe even accused a rival of cheating in the poetry contest by smelling of saffron too boldly. He lost. The poem? Still quoted. Today in wedding toasts. Onto onions, yes onions. Raw roasted, mashed into paste. Believed to increase blood flow and confidence, they were often served before marriage nights. One tale describes a bride who refused to bathe in rose water, demanding instead a soup of black onions and cinnamon. He will love me honestly, she said, or not at all. Her marriage lasted 27 years, and her recipe survived as folklore. Another story, perhaps apocryphal, involves a harem girl who wore a clove of garlic on a cord between her breasts. She claimed it kept her grounded and irresistible. The king hated the smell. She became a folk hero. Goat brain, though, that's where things get weird. Crushed, mixed with almonds and pomegranate molasses, it was used as a libido enhancer for men of a certain age. One general, facing both an uprising and a disappointing second wife, ordered 2 pounds of it weekly. he won the war. His wife? Still unimpressed. The irony? She was reportedly smuggling figs, also considered an aphrodisiac to her favorite lute player. Figs in Persian erotic symbolism weren't just fruit. They were metaphors, poems, and on at least one occasion, scandalous paintings. A famous artist once painted a fig being peeled by moonlight. The court banned it within a week. The painting disappeared. The artist, however, received twice as many commissions afterward. Let's pivot to a lesser-known stimulant, asafoetida. Nicknamed devil's sweat, it smells horrific raw but transforms when cooked. It was often used in broths intended for post-bath intimacy, spiced just enough to wake the spirit and silence the mind. One apothecary's journal warns, do not overuse, lest love become noise. In one documented case, a young merchant overindulged and proposed to 3 women in a single afternoon. All declined. He later became a monk. Possibly unrelated. Now, the fringe details you didn't ask for but absolutely needed. Some potions included powdered pearls, crushed emeralds, or dried snake skin. Ingredients meant less for chemistry and more for theatrics. It wasn't about what worked, it was about believing it might. That belief, combined with candlelight, poetry, and the right breeze, did more than any goat brain ever could. There was even a popular saying, a lover with hope is already halfway kissed. In the bustling corners of Isfahan and Shiraz, markets teemed with merchants peddling miracle tonics. Some whispered, some shouted. All of them carried small glass vials tied with thread and sealed with beeswax. One legendary merchant, a woman named Soraya, claimed to blend her recipes based on the customer's scent and heartbreak history. She charged double for those who claimed they were just curious. Her most expensive product, a powder called First Kiss, ingredients unknown. Directions simple, blow it toward someone and say nothing. One noble woman allegedly used it during a royal feast. The man she targeted proposed marriage 3 days later. He was married to someone else. Scandal, poem, exile. Soraya's business tripled. Now, before you dismiss this as superstition, consider the deeper reality. These recipes weren't just culinary flirtations, they were acts of agency. In a world where love was often arranged, restricted, or reduced to transaction, the kitchen and the apothecary became theaters of rebellion. Women who couldn't choose their lovers could choose how they smelled, what they served, what they stirred into. The stew. Men too nervous princes, insecure poets, traveling merchants could buy courage by the spoonful. Maybe it didn't work, but maybe it didn't need to. Maybe the ritual itself, the chopping, the boiling, the sprinkling was a kind of spell. There's a surviving text titled The Palette of Passion, handwritten in neat columns with margin. Notes like add less mint unless she prefers older men. It contains recipes, sure, but also advice. If his tongue dries before his words, it reads, give him lime water with crushed ice and smile slowly. Another, if she speaks of sorrow during dessert, touch her wrist and say nothing. It's half cookbook, half heartbreak diary. No author listed. But the final line reads, if love fails, at least let dinner be good. And here's the most delicious irony. While courts banned some of these concoctions, they also consumed them in secret. Royal kitchens were stocked with everything from rose preserves to black pepper truffles. One Shah's chef recorded a dish called Whispers Under Pomegranate, served only during eclipses and always followed by poetry recitation. Another kitchen hand was dismissed for sneaking extra nutmeg into the queen's tea. The accusation, stirring more than flavor. So, tonight, before you sleep, let your senses wander. Smell the cinnamon in your dreams. Taste the honey in someone's name. In ancient Persia, love didn't just touch your heart. It tricked your tongue, coated your lips, and sizzled in your belly. You didn't just fall for someone. You simmered for them, slowly, all night. the ink is still fresh on the orders. You can smell the metal of the swords, hear the rustle of leather armor, feel the tension crackling in the air like a string pulled too tight. The camp is a machine of discipline rows, of tents, soldiers sharpening blades, horses stamping in dust. But underneath that rhythm, something softer breathes. You're walking through the quiet space between battles, the hours before blood, when even the fiercest warriors remember what they're fighting for and who they left behind. This is where love lived in armor. In ancient Persia, even on the battlefield, desire didn't sleep. It just changed uniforms. And tonight, you'll read the letters that never made it home. Start with the obvious. Persian soldiers didn't travel light. Along with weapons and rations, they carried charms, hair ribbons, bits of embroidered cloth. Some tucked pressed flowers into the lining of their breastplates. Others were rings inscribed with names, not of wives, but of sweethearts they met. For only one night in a city they might never see again. And they wrote furiously, longingly, often without paper. Messages scratched into leather, onto pieces of pottery, sometimes even etched onto the inner flaps of their helmets, so the words touched their skulls before the enemy's arrows ever could. These weren't military dispatches. These were love. Letters to ghosts, to memories, to maybe some days that lived hundreds of miles away. There's a documented case of a soldier named Kava who wrote to his lover, whom he called Moon Behind the Curtain, before every major battle. He sealed the letters in beeswax and gave them to his horse's groom. After Kava's death, the groom delivered 12 unread letters to a woman who lived above a dye shop in Susa. She read them all in one sitting and reportedly went silent. For 3 months. The 12th letter contained a poem. If I die before you wake, bury my name in your voice and let me speak only when you laugh. That line is now etched into a statue near the ruins of Ekbatana. Tourists think it's from a philosopher. Locals know better. Love on the battlefield wasn't just sentimental, it was strategic. Kings encouraged their men to keep attachments back home. A soldier with someone waiting was harder to bribe, more careful with his life, more likely to return and less likely to defect. Some commanders even hired poets to circulate through camps, composing verses on request. Make it sound like she still waits, one would say, even if she doesn't. One poet, Devout, became so beloved that soldiers carried his verses into battle like talismans. When he was killed during a skirmish, his ashes were mixed with ink and used to pen final letters for the dying. That ink, they said, burned on the page. Fringe detail for the night. Some soldiers believed that speaking your lover's name before battle would either protect you or doom you. It depended on the tone. Say it with hope, and it became a shield. Say it with regret, and the gods might mark you for mercy or for madness. One unit of archers reportedly chanted their lovers' names before releasing arrows, claiming it made their aim truer. Another commander banned all romantic writing in his ranks after a soldier deserted to chase a girl he saw in a dream. She turned out to be real. He never came back. The commander was assassinated a year later, rumored to be revenge. But who knows? Love has long fingers. Now imagine the campfires. Low flames, low voices, stories traded like food. One soldier tells of a woman who tied his sandals with almond blossoms the night before he left. Another describes a kiss stolen behind a date stall in Ray. Someone recites a poem, not his own, but no one cares. It's the rhythm that matters, the memory, the ache. These aren't the clean, noble tales of history books. These are love. Stories with mud on their boots and bandages on their wrists. And then there were the women who wrote back. Not all did. Some couldn't. Some didn't know how. Others chose silence, too angry, too heartbroken, or simply too tired of waiting. But the ones who did, their letters were electric. One scroll, preserved miraculously in a salt cavern, reads, "You said you fight for our future. I say win or lose, come home with a face I still know." Another, from a baker's daughter to a cavalry scout. I wear your name like a bruise. Unseen, tender, mine. Some of these letters never reached their destinations. Some were buried with their recipients. Others were passed from soldier to soldier, treasured like relics. Not because of the content, but because someone, somewhere still remembered someone else enough to write. A side note, deliciously strange. Persian generals occasionally consulted love omens before major battles. A priestess would interpret dreams or read tea leaves left from letters soaked in hot water. Yes, love-infused divination. If a name appeared in the bubbles, it meant victory. If the paper dissolved, retreat was advised. One general ignored the signs. His forces were crushed. The priestess vanished. Legend says she fled with a messenger boy who'd been delivering letters for both sides. Their love story? Lost. But the ritual survived, and it wasn't just men. Persian women also fought. Not always on front lines, but in defense of cities, in spy networks, in coded communications stitched into shawls. One legendary figure, Persia of Hamadan, wrote coded reports for the army and signed them with love poems. She was never caught. Her signal to confirm a message was received. A pressed violet sent anonymously to the next town. One soldier is in spy networks, in coded communications stitched into shawls. One legendary figure, Persia of Hamadan, wrote coded reports for the army and signed them with love poems. She was never caught. Her signal to confirm a message was received. A pressed violet sent anonymously to the next town. One soldier is said to have kept his last violet pinned inside his tunic for 20 years. When he died, it was still there, dry, brittle, intact. And what of the final letters? The ones never sent, never read. They existed in droves. One collection, found in a ruined camp, contained dozens of unsent scrolls. Some were too honest, others too ashamed. I kissed her goodbye and told her to forget me. But I didn't mean it. Another, he said he'd wait. I didn't ask for how long. That was my mistake. These weren't grand, sweeping epics. These were human fragments. The war of love running parallel to the war of empires. So tonight, as you lie still and listen to the silence between your own thoughts, remember this. Love didn't wait at home while the swords clashed. It rode beside the warriors. It tucked itself into saddlebags. It burned in campfires and slept beneath helmets. It was scrawled in margins, whispered into wounds, and sometimes, just sometimes, it was the only thing that made coming home worth surviving for. The music hits you before the door does, a thrum of drum beats low enough to stir your stomach. Strings that seem to weep and seduce in the same breath. And a voice, female, soaked in honey and fire. You're not in a palace tonight. Not in a temple, nor a scholar's garden. You're somewhere louder, looser, and more alive. Welcome to the taverns of ancient Persia, where the air smelled like wine, spilled dreams, and roasted lamb grease. And where love didn't ask for permission. This is where rules were smudged with coal and wiped away with the back of a calloused hand. Here, under flickering oil lamps and sticky floors, people let themselves fall, and sometimes rise again. Forget what you've heard about Persian culture being all ritual and reserve. For every scroll and incense-drenched poem, there was a tavern tucked between two quiet alleys, run by someone with more secrets than table space, where the real passions unfolded. These weren't dens of sin, they were altars of honesty. And at the center of everyone stood the tavern girls, unlicensed charmers, untrained performers, and unholy counselors to soldiers, scholars, and sad men who'd lost too many chess matches to their own regrets. Their hair smelled of smoke and saffron. Their jokes were too sharp for the court, and their dance wasn't choreography, it was confession. One such legend was Lele, known in 4 provinces for dancing barefoot on spilled wine without ever staining her solace. She didn't perform for coin. She performed for verses. If you recited a poem she liked, she'd dance. If not, she'd pour your wine with a smirk and whisper where your rival was drinking that night. Once, a visiting scribe recited a line comparing her eyes to twin fires reflected in a wolf's wet breath. She stopped dancing mid-step, stared at him, and said, "You've kissed too many scrolls. Try a mouth next time." He returned to the palace, wrote nothing for a year. The wine in these places wasn't the royal stuff. No gold goblets, no saffron infusions or rose petal floats. This was thick, dark, fermented from dates or honey, poured from clay jugs chipped by years of reckless cheer. And yet, it worked better than any court banquet. One sip softened your tongue, two made you brave. Three, well, by then, someone was probably kissing someone else, or fighting about poetry, or weeping into their own lap about a lover they weren't even sure they'd imagined. And the songs, oh, the songs. Not delicate lutes or scholarly chants. These were gut-deep, sweat-slicked epics about women who ran off with bandits, boys who loved horses more, and fathers who drank themselves poetic to forget the names of their wives. They weren't sung with skill. They were sung with pain, and occasionally mid-song, someone would stand, raise a goblet, and yell, "That's mine." Not because they'd written it, but because it described them too well. Quirky footnote: some taverns hosted duels of desire, competitive flirting sessions judged by laughter, sighs, or thrown almonds. One woman in Tabriz was undefeated. For 6 months, until a man from Sistan complimented her wrists in a metaphor involving rain, rope, and regret. She retired on the spot, became a midwife. Still whispered that metaphor to nervous brides on their wedding night. You're welcome. Taverns were also places of strange justice, heartbreak tribunals. If someone had been wronged, abandoned, betrayed, ghosted before ghosting had a name, they'd come here to testify. Not to a judge, to the crowd. They'd recite their tale. The accused could defend themselves, if present. Sometimes fights broke out, sometimes kisses. One record describes a man who confessed to stealing his best friend's bride. The friend wept. The bride punched him. The tavern girl poured them both more wine. They left together. The thief? He became a monk. Or a merchant. Depends who you ask. And then there were the letters. Passed under tables. Read aloud on dares. Burned ceremonially when the pain got too loud. One tavern in Shiraz had a wall of words where patrons pinned up lines they couldn't bear to keep. Most were short. Some were devastating. You said I was home, then you moved. Another, I was the poem. You were the pause. One regular wrote the same line every week. Come back, or at least send the earrings. The earrings never came. Let's talk about the bartenders, because they weren't just wine pourers. They were matchmakers, therapists, spies. One, named Omid, was rumored to know who loved whom in every district. He could read longing in a cough, betrayal in a silence, and once prevented a duel by swapping 2 cups before anyone noticed. His tavern had no sign, just a painted bird above the door. When he died, 12 women claimed to have written his obituary. None were his wives. All of them left roses by the threshold. Even religion didn't stay out. Poets like Hafez wrote of taverns as sacred spaces where wine was a metaphor, the tavern keeper a kind of divine guide. Drunkenness meant shedding the ego, kissing your flaws, daring to feel fully. That metaphor, however, was often lost on actual drunk people who simply fell in love, loudly, messily, gloriously, and then threw up behind the firewood stack. One mullah famously entered a tavern to preach against sin. He left married. The bride? A lute player who claimed God whispered in her high notes. Fringe tidbit: some Persian taverns had scent rituals. You entered through smoke, usually myrrh or oud, and exited through rosewater mist, symbolizing rebirth. The message was clear: leave your shame at the door, but don't take your regret home either. It wasn't therapy. It was transformation. You came in broken. You left a little drunker, a little lighter, maybe a little braver. And what of the lovers born here? Do they last? Sometimes. More often, they fade with the dawn, remembered only in hiccups and chorus lines. But some linger. One tale tells of a woman who met her beloved at a tavern, danced once, then vowed to never see him again. "This night is too perfect," she said. "Let's not ruin it with real life." He waited 7 years. She returned on the 8th. They danced again. No words. Just the same rhythm, slightly slower. Like remembering something you never forgot. So as you drift off tonight, let the music linger. Let your heart loosen just enough to feel the things you've hidden under the table. In ancient Persia, love didn't just wear robes and write poems. Sometimes it spilled its wine, laughed too loud, and woke up with ink on its wrist and someone else's song in its mouth. And sometimes that was enough. A hush falls before you even push open the garden gate, impossibly heavy, carved with vines that seem to coil like living serpents. You step inside, and the world tilts. It's dusk, and lanterns hang from branches like captured stars. Petals drift across the stone paths, sticky with dew and memories. You've reached what some whispered was the Pleasure Bureau, a half-mythical institution rumored to train both desire and diplomacy. It's not a tavern, not a harem. It's a school of seduction run by bureaucrats in robes and teachers. In Perfume, where love was catalogued, coached, and occasionally censored, but always studied, you walk past pavilions where courtesans practice storytelling aloud, reciting erotic poems as lessons in voice control and emotional pacing. Other rooms host silent rehearsals, lovers role-playing in veils, responding only with glances and gestures, learning how to let suggestion linger. Inside a courtyard, women practice perfume code. Each fragrance means a phrase. Saffron for longing, frankincense for invitation, rose for devotion, amber for wariness. A misstep in scent could mean social exile, or a scandal worthy of palace walls. And near the fountain, you overhear a teacher describing the geometry of touch, how far to lean, when to pause, how much backstory to reveal with your posture. It feels like espionage cloaked in silk, education masquerading as art, discipline for delight. One whispered legend says the bureau was founded not by a king, but by a queen scorned, who realized that emotional literacy was the secret currency of her court. She hired eunuchs, poets, healers, astrologers, and dancers to create curricula, courses in heartbreak prevention, syllabus in scent diplomacy, examinations in devotion. By night, students practiced clandestine performances for visiting dignitaries. By day, they cataloged the results in scrolls nobody ever read. The bureau, some say, produced courtesans who could destroy dynasties or save them with nothing more than a well-timed side. There was at least one real bureau. Yes, documents refer to a Ministry of Effective Affairs in later Persian. Courts, where a staff monitored emotional unrest, wrote protocols for allowable attachment, even scripted apology letters for nobles whose affairs leaked into politics. Historians still argue whether that bureaucracy was effective or just another bureaucratic joke. But the idea that love could be managed, taught, and commodified? That idea held power. Let's sharpen with a true story. A princess once sent her rival a training manual bound in velvet and scented with amber as a snide invitation to the same love chamber curriculum. The rival followed it diligently, aced the final exam, and won over the Shah with deliberately slow breathing and perfectly timed ankle exposure. The princess, furious, tried to ban the manual. The manual disappeared. But rumor says one copy resurfaced in a Brussels archive centuries later, annotated in Persian and French. Asterisk. She never knew she was outclassed until she inhaled the lesson. Asterisk courses included poetry of pretense, how to fake interest long enough to be noticed, and silk script, a class in folding fabric so that hidden messages would reveal themselves only in candlelight shadows. There was a module on eunuch confidential, the ethics of emotional surveillance and dream rituals, where students learned to induce lucid vision so that lovers would appear in dreams on cue. One account mentions a potion that, when rubbed on pillow seams, supposedly sent shared hallucinations of each other's faces. Scholars debate whether that was spiritual chemistry or collective hysteria. But the account survives, and a broken vial was found in Persepolis's ruins, labeled Sleep Sweet. Of course, the Bureau also had its critics. Religious leaders accused it of corrupting young women into professionals of persuasion. Traditionalists sneered at its emotional psychometrics, mocking its attempt to quantify yearning or grade gestures. Yet courtiers whispered that many brides to be passed through its doors, not to learn seduction, but to miraculously feel less terrified on wedding nights. A favorite exam question: when should one fake tears? Immediately, or when asked to smile back? The difference meant control. The right answer? Never stay there too long. You find yourself drawn toward a pavilion built entirely of latticework. Inside, a single instructor demonstrates something called veiled conversation, the art of speaking through fabric. You watch as two women, one initiate take turns whispering questions and answers through a piece of gauze. The effect is hypnotic. The voice is soft. The message arrives twice, once in words, once in suggestion. It feels like reading a poem and a confession simultaneously. Here's a speculative fringe detail. Some say the Bureau kept dossiers on emotional compatibility reports on which woman complimented which attire best, who met gaze patterns with, which courtiers, which scents triggered shared dreams. These records, allegedly, were passed down through generations of palace officials, dossiers that tracked affection as carefully as crop yields. It's unclear if they exist today or if they ever existed at all. But intelligence gathering and intimacy mapping, that is undeniably seductive. The Bureau also hosted final performances, masked balls, where graduates enacted love stories using only scent gestures and slow dance. Guests would guess who was behind the masks. Some courtiers remained silent, watching. Others laughed. Some left engaged. One masked pair reportedly upset court protocol by kissing barely and vanished the next day. No scandal, no investigation, just absence. Legend says they escaped together to a distant province. Their masks were preserved in a shrine. Nobody dared try them on. There were darker lessons. 2. Some students were taught how to feign illness to avoid an arranged match, or how to use covert messages in embroidery, in blood-red stitches, in prayer beads to blackmail rivals or curry favor. It was emotional cunning under the guise of refinement. One text found by archaeologists lists under advanced manipulation. Asterisk, teach the scent of betrayal in jasmine oil. Plant doubt in a braised fig, and record loyalty through a borrowed scarf. Asterisk, whether that list formed part of official curriculum or court gossip remains unclear but powerful. And what of love itself? In a place where affection could be professional, performance, or politically prescribed, was sincerity possible? Some graduates claimed yes. Some said the Bureau taught them to recognize torture disguised as training. Some refused to take final exams. Still others turned into teachers themselves, working in palace detachments or distant courts, passing on the lessons in twilight salons. Many lineages not of blood, but of emotional craft, trace back to those quiet gardens. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine that garden again, lanterns swaying, petals scattered like punctuation marks, voices rehearsed with intent, perfumes timed like punctuation, and a world where love was both thesis and playbook. Picture courtesans bowing in training, eunuchs grading gestures, poets editing sighs into syllables. Then drift asleep, wondering if your dreams might be the Bureau's final exam and whether you're ready to pass. A single sheet of paper flutters in the breeze, caught on a cedar branch by the palace wall. The message is short, 3 words. In delicate Persian, remember our song. You lean forward, heart pounding, because this is not a love letter. It's a ghost whisper woven into the empire's margins. You're stepping now into the world of courts crumbling, dynasties waning, and the surviving echoes of love carried in perfumed letters, clandestine verse, and evaporating memory. This is where secret rituals meet fate, and the grand edifices of power fall quiet so passion can breathe. Welcome to the ghosts of perfumed letters. Imagine dusty scrolls unearthed from ruined libraries, rings tarnished, ink faded. Yet somehow, the aroma lingers: rosewater, sandalwood, tears. These fragments, written generations later, are all that remain. Some letters are so brittle, they disintegrate when you read them. Others were hidden inside books destined to burn. One fragment recovered from a burned-out palace had only 2 lines. Asterisk. I heard your breath in the courtyard stillness. I carved your name on the jar before I fled. Asterisk. That jar shattered centuries ago, but modern labs still detect faint musk residue where the engraving once was. Historians still argue whether the scent survives chemically or metaphysically. These aren't just old messages. They're messages that outlived the messengers. One story recounts a sealed sack of letters buried with a noblewoman who died in childbirth. After her tomb was rediscovered centuries later, nothing remained of her body. But among the rubble, rolled bundles tied with silk. When unwrapped, they released a scent described as sweet and sorrowful. The townsfolk say the air changed afterward, ripe with longing. A few residents claimed dreams returned. Love lost, briefly found again. Another, or perhaps the same legend, tells of courtesans who, before a rival city's siege, burned there, perfumed letters in a bonfire, and gave the ashes to their lovers. They said the smoke would carry their souls to them if they survived. When the siege ended, the letters were gone, and so were most of the lovers. Smoke as messenger. Poetry as funeral pyre. In some palace ruins, archaeologists found clay tablets, engraved with anonymous pleas. Marry me in another life, or asterisk. Let this jar outlive our betrayal. The tablets were intentionally broken before burial as symbolic severing. But in one rare find, someone later glued them back together. The cracks still visible, the verse reconstructed. Scent analysis suggests echoes of citrus and dust not. Morning dew, but memory. These perfumed letters belong to all. These perfumed letters belong to ordinary and royal people alike. A tax collector wrote one to his lover in a nearby province. A concubine sent notes hidden in hairpins. A poet scribbled half-formed lines on linen scraps and slipped them under rugs. Some messages were never delivered. Some came centuries later. One potter discovered an unsent love poem stuck to the bottom of a jug in a cellar, a verse about light and shadow. He published it modernly on social media. Within days, readers translated it into 6 languages. The poem has since been posted on mirrors around the world. Stranger proof of immortality is hard to find. Here's a fragment scholar's favorite. Asterisk. If your ghost visits me at midnight, I'll pour wine into the empty cup. Asterisk. It's scratched into a shard. The wine never came. The cup, however, is preserved in a museum. Visitors whisper into it at 12 a.m. Somebody said if you listen closely enough, you can hear a heartbeat echo back. But these letters did more than haunt, they altered politics. One fragment refers to a hidden heir, a child conceived in secret, a lineage erased by palace intrigue, but preserved in the dusty verses a concubine wrote. Later, when that line claimed the throne, historians discovered the letters and realized the legitimate successor had been hidden in plain sight. Poetry overturned empire. Love mattered then, as more than emotion. It became power. Not all letters were from women. A eunuch sent a note to the queen, just a single line, asterisk. I stood outside your window while you slept. No name, no signature. She kept the jar it was hidden in. In her will, she wrote that it should remain unopened until the end of her reign. When she died, the jar was found empty. A few drops of rose oil remained inside. It smelled of regret and reverence. Some ruins revealed scent jars, tiny sealed bottles meant to preserve the aroma of a letter. One shard still carries Palo Santo and dried violet. Another smells faintly of goat's milk and jasmine, possibly the remains of a farewell poem. Scholars debate whether these jars were spiritual relics or literal time capsules. But to anyone who opened one, the experience was unmistakable. The past breathing its lost and longing self back into the present. Fringe history aside, some of these letters influenced art. Miniature paintings depicted women holding transparent scrolls with faded lines no scholar could decode. Musicians composed pieces titled Song of the Unknown Name, or asterisk, Echo After Midnight, asterisk inspired by lines found crumpled under palace benches. A set of melodies claims to be derived from a poem that vanished, only its tune remains. It's performed on certain anniversaries in Shiraz under moonlight. And the biggest mystery, the one you feel breathing through these scenes, is how love survived when structures failed. Dynasties fell, capitals burned, languages changed. Yet these perfumed whispers remained, pushing through rubble, memory, scent. Love was the parasite that survived the host. The scent that lingered in a broken jar. The poem that outlasted the poet. So tonight, as you drift into your own quiet, imagine the faintest scent of rose on your pillow. Imagine a word scratched into a pot you didn't write it. It's just there. You don't know its meaning, but its atoms remember someone who did. And maybe that's enough. You're standing in a half-abandoned courtyard where the sun's last rays set the cracked marble glowing like embers. Lime trees droop overhead, their fruit heavy with memory. There's dust on every surface, silence in every corner, and the faint echo of a flute that seems to mourn its own notes. You've arrived at the twilight zone of Persian love, when dynasties fall, courts fragment, and only rituals stubbornly refuse to die. This is the final act. Ghosts of perfumed letters meeting pleasure bureau whispers. The visible cracks in a world built on longing. Here, love isn't ceremonial, it's eternal. And tonight, you feel it in the stillness between steps. Imagine courtiers returning from exile to find their chambers looted, their scrolls burned, their lovers gone, but not entirely. Because in hidden jars and buried boxes, in tiles beneath floorboards, perfumed lines remained. A poem carved on a broken pane, a verse stitched into a belt, a whisper pressed into clay. These traces survived not by accident, but by intention, by heartbreak's refusal to disappear. One woman, returning to the ruins of her childhood home, found an old maze made of hedges. In the center was a petal-stained stone that read, asterisk, I waited while the empire waited. Scholars still argue who wrote it, but no one questions what it means. You walk beneath arches that once hosted laughter, now host geckos. You see mosaics faded into near-nothingness, but run your fingers along them and sometimes feel a ridge, a line that belonged to someone's promise. Nearby, you find fragments of fragrance jars, once filled with rosewater letters, now empty, but still scented if you breathe close enough. The smell is faint, dusty, human. It's the lingering of rituals we can't perform anymore, but which continue in absence. There's a tale of two lovers, a concubine and a scribe, who hid love. Letters inside a mosaic urn beneath this very courtyard. When the court fell, all records were destroyed except that urn. Centuries later, the mosaic cracked during renovation, revealing letters sealed in beeswax. They wrote of moonlit gardens, forbidden gardens, and hopes sewn into sandalwood petals. The letters were unreadable, but smelled unmistakably of longing. They're now affixed in a museum display behind glass, labeled asterisk, unread, but remembered. Visitors weep. Here, something else survives. The sound of winding up. You can almost hear the soft friction of a silk skirt brushing tile, the rasp of a reed pen across parchment, a flute note lifting off into dusk. These aren't ghosts, they're rituals echoing. Each breath you take in this courtyard is bound to centuries of practice. Training in the bureau, bathhouse secrets, battlefield poems, tavern songs, caravan whispers. One poet described this place as the library of absence. You could even consider it a curriculum. How love adapts. How longing outlasts law. So as you walk away, note this. Love doesn't vanish because structures crumble. It retreats. It hides. It perfumes cracks. It writes whisper, leaving verses. And sometimes, when all else fades, it speaks from the ruins. The courtyards may shift, the rulers may change, but the ritual stays. The look, the smell, the verse, the pearl dropped into clay, the message unsent but still understood. That is the legacy. As dusk deepens outside your window, the light softens and your breathing slows. In the hush that follows, let these words settle into your bones like the faint scent of rosewater on ancient marble. You've walked through gardens of longing, felt rituals woven into steam and ink, heard love whispered on the wind after empires fell. None of it remains intact, but something eternal survived. The courage to write when they said you couldn't, to touch when they insisted you mustn't, to love when it demanded everything. Your eyes grow heavy. The grains of perfume in your memory grow stronger than the world outside. Let the scent of jasmine and saffron mingle with the quiet pulse of your heartbeat. Let the knowledge that love outlives its structures, the bureau, the bathhouse, the battlefield, the palace, be your final companion tonight. Rest now, nestled in the warmth of stories that refuse to die. Tomorrow may demand practicality, daylight, daily routines, but tonight belongs to memory, ritual, and whispers carried across centuries. You listened. You felt. You remembered. Let that be enough. End of script. Sweet dreams.